Hello, everybody. This is NGO Soul+Strategy. And today we're going to talk about an interesting new book. It's called Beyond the Boomerang, From Transnational Advocacy Networks to Transscalar Advocacy in International Politics. And let me tell you something about the two authors before I even introduce their bios. I know Christopher Pallas and Elizabeth Bloodgood from what I call jokingly my accidental academic past. We used to meet annually at academic conferences of nonprofit scholars. And I know Chris and Beth to do good work in the arena of international relations, nonprofit studies, and conflict management. Chris and Beth have written a relatively new edited volume, and I mentioned the title already, Beyond the Boomerang, From Transnational Advocacy Networks to Transscalar Advocacy in International Politics. And today we're going to talk with Chris and Beth about the core arguments of their book. Now, obviously, advocacy and campaigning approaches are very important topics for NGOs. So I was keen to interview them today to hear how our guests, Chris and Beth, argue that how we think about advocacy strategies in relation to Global North and Global South founded NGOs is really overdue for an update. You will hear also how our interview will link to hot topics of today, such as decolonizing aid, shifting power and agency between Global South founded and Global North founded NGOs. A shift that really has already been well on its way for 10 plus years, I would argue. Also, I suggest, dear listeners, that you keep an ear out for what their argument in the book means for changes in what are future legitimate and needed roles for Global North NGOs. So with that introduction, welcome Chris and Beth.
Thanks for having us.
You're so welcome, and good to have you too as well, Chris. So let me tell you, listeners, a little bit about each of their bios. So Christopher Pallas is professor of conflict management at the Department of Political Science and International Affairs at Kennesaw University in Georgia, here in the US. His research focuses on non-governmental organizations and their role in international policymaking and development. And one of his research projects in the recent past focused on NGOs in the HIV/AIDS and perhaps also other sectors in Vietnam. And that always gets my attention because I used to work there at one point, although that's now a long time ago. And Beth, Elizabeth Bloodgood, is associate professor at Concordia University in Montreal, Quebec, Canada. And she was before this a lecturer at the University of Pennsylvania and an assistant professor at Dartmouth College here in the US. So maybe starting with Beth and then Chris, can you introduce us a little bit to yourselves by describing your research agendas overall and the topics that you're most interested in? Beth, you first, please.
Thanks. That's sort of a quick question or big question to answer quickly. So I guess my initial interest was understanding how it was that NGOs could shift policy, and started off by looking at information claims. And so that the power of expertise, but also providing information that state decision makers maybe didn't have, or in a frame that they didn't quite conceptualize, to see if that would shift policy, both practice and also outcomes. And then that shifted then to looking at networking as the thing that was necessary to get information from place to place to place, and then trying to understand if networking, which was seen as sort of crucial and sort of a fundamental part of being an NGO, at least from the theory side, was really as good a thing as expected, and could actually networking have downsides in terms of causing organizations to put too much effort into things that had too little payoff. And so we tried to model that for a bit formally.
That's interesting, but please keep going.
And then also switch to this idea of thinking about information environments writ large. And so trying to look instead at what information NGOs had available about themselves, but also what information governments had available about NGOs. And if this was information that was broadly shared, were there deliberate asymmetries that would actually help to create power imbalances between organizations and also between the organizations and governments? and then started working with an organization here in Montreal that's main goal was to make data more available, more accessible to organizations to help to even out that imbalance, but also to help the sector in general do better, because they would have more of a sense of what was really needed versus narratives that might have been a little bit crafted towards strategic ends, or just were based upon common sense that actually wasn't common sense. And so trying to get more data to help the sector understand itself and needs about itself globally, but also Canada and US.
Okay, thank you for that introduction. Chris, how about you?
Okay, well, first I'll say that I started out actually in a practitioner role. I did 4 years with a faith-based non-governmental organization, then I did my master's, and I did a couple of years in West Africa with the Peace Corps, and then I went back and did my PhD. So my first, many years ago, academic article was actually on faith-based organizations and their advocacy with the World Bank. And then from there, I transitioned to looking at advocacy around development policy more broadly. And that's been really my mainstay throughout my academic career, is looking at global patterns in advocacy, and especially development policy and the representation of developing country stakeholders in international policymaking. Now, a number of years ago, I went to Vietnam to look at local NGOs and their ability to do advocacy upwards. When I was engaging with my local counterparts, the other thing that they said to me is, well, your research topic's all fine and good, but the thing that's really interesting to us is foreign aid reduction, because that was the thing that was really affecting NGOs in the HIV/AIDS sector in Vietnam at that time. And so I developed a research agenda around that to help them find the information that they needed. And that spiraled into a kind of a parallel research agenda that I have, which is on the impact of foreign aid reduction. So there's a lot of research that's been done on what happens to local NGOs when foreign aid comes in, but not nearly as much research on what happens when foreign aid comes out. And so working with some different partners, including Mark Seidel and Susan Appy, we've done a lot of work on that topic. And now that topic, I think, has become much more mainstream than it was 10 years ago when we started out. But that's the second thing that I've worked on as well.
Nice, nice. And by the way, Chris, I remember your article on faith-based organizations and the World Bank. I used it in my teaching when I was at the Maxwell School at Syracuse University. So turning now to, let's start unravel. No, that's not the right English. Let's start unpacking the core arguments in the book. So you start in the book, as I understand, at least tell me if I'm wrong, first explaining to the readers, when did international advocacy begin attracting the attention from academics at all, and why did it start to attract that? So maybe, Beth, let's start with you. When and why?
Certainly. So again, sort of mid to late 90s is when some of the kind of big academic work came out. Keck and Sinking's sort of dominant boomerang model was the thing that caught attention and sort of dominated the literature for 20 years. And with all respect to both Keck and Sinking, that one image wasn't intended to be everything that was in the book, but it kind of caught attention about how it was that advocacy worked ostensibly. Again, thinking particularly about organizations in less democratic, less developed countries that had a hard time accessing government, generally speaking, because there was no opportunities involved, and how they might turn to international counterparts, either because it was safer. So the classic example was Argentina. If you're a human rights defender in Argentina, it's not a very good idea to go against a military junta that had a habit of disappearing people. So instead you go to Amnesty International and then have them go to their international partners, either the United States government or to the United Nations, to then apply pressure upon the government. So the idea of this boomerang, because you couldn't target the target directly, you went around the long way because it was safer and more effective. And so that kind of captured the imagination. A lot of the literature, though, spent way too much time trying to show that NGOs mattered, and so didn't do a lot of detailed work on how and why. And so a lot of the complexity and nuance of what organizations were doing was lost, because it just really became about trying to prove cases that demonstrated that sort of less powerful organizations that were non-state could get states to do things they wouldn't otherwise do. So I think it kind of got stuck for a while on this idea of showing that they mattered versus getting very much into the how and why.
I see. Realizing that many of my listeners are not coming from academia, have not been exposed to these literatures, and also that many of them do not have English as their first native language, as is also, by the way, the case for me. Chris, may I ask you to making sure that I want to make sure that our audience understands the boomerang model. Can you recap what Beth just said about the boomerang model, almost that we can visualize it as we are listening?
Sure. So the first thing I'll say is many of your readers on the practitioner side will probably recognize that NGO advocacy, at least to my mind, really started to take off in the 1980s with like pushes back against structural adjustment in particular, as well as kind of burgeoning environmentalism. But it was really in the 1990s when there were some very notable successes like Jubilee 2000 and the Ottawa Convention banning landmines that academics, I think, started to pay attention. So at risk of disparaging our profession, I'll say that academics tend to lag practitioners by about 5 to 10 years in terms of our awareness of what's actually happening. Yeah. And so when academics started to notice, basically the question was, how is it that NGOs are achieving this kind of success? Like we see NGOs, chalking up some big wins, or seeming to chalk up some big wins, or claim some big wins in the international arena. How is that happening? And so what Keck and Seekink hypothesized with some very good data was that local NGOs that were engaging with local issues like human rights abuses in Latin America would try to get those things addressed locally by engaging with their national government or municipal authorities, whatever it was, and then would often be stymied because of a lack of democracy or because of corruption. And when they were stymied, they would reach out to international NGOs, and those international NGOs would form the international campaign or would launch the international campaign. And that international campaign would enlist the help of those northern NGOs governments. So you'd reach out to Oxfam, to Amnesty International, and they would get the United States government or the British government involved. And then those governments in turn would either put pressure directly on the southern country government, or those northern governments would work with an international institution like the UN or the World Bank, and then those organizations in turn would put pressure on the national government. And so that helped explain a variety of different things. It helped explain say new human rights protocols at the UN and pressure to reform human rights abuses. It helped explain changes in World Bank projects to help better respect the rights of indigenous peoples. And the model was very effective because it worked.
Yeah.
I mean, it really did explain a lot of what was going on at the time.
Yeah, and I'm sure that many of the practitioners who are listening to this can recognize, right, the model. It's very classic in that sense. But turning back to you now, Beth, what was the problem with this dominant narrative in how these important academics in international relations as a field of study and practice, if you will, what was the problem or what was limiting about that narrative? Beth.
So we sort of examined a number of different case studies to kind of come up from the grounds up with some empirical patterns that seemed to be adding up that were counter to that narrative. And again, so we grouped them into two things. So one had to do with agency of organizations and activists, and the other had to do with issues around kind of how the environment itself had changed. So kind of the structures in which these organizations were operating. So when it came to the sort of first categories about kind of the natures of the actors, so one of the big changes we kept seeing over and over again is that this need for a northern partner didn't seem to hold true. There seemed to be a number of powerful, strong organizations that actually had good knowledge, they had great skills, they had professionalization and resources, and better access to their own governments. And so you have kind of rising Southern organizations that were strong, professional, effective, and they didn't need, which was also linked at the same time to some of the changes globally, that just as you had these organizations that were coming to their own in their own countries, there also was this growing sense at which it wasn't appropriate, it wasn't legitimate for international organizations to come and interfere in the domestic politics of these other countries. And so whether it was a matter of the domestic wanting to sort of take over kind of control of itself and keep out the foreign partners, or the foreign partners being explicitly blocked by changes in regulation, so being kind of unable to fund organizations, unable to invest money in countries because they were seen as foreign agents, for instance, in the most extreme cases. So it was both a sense in which they were less needed, they were also less wanted, and they were less able to get into many of these environments that seemed to sort of change the landscape pretty dramatically.
Yeah, and so what Beth, what you just would in your last couple of sentences were talking is about what many practitioners would refer to as either shrinking civic space or shifting civic space, but where the civic, so both the legal and political space and even the normative space and the amount of public support that there was for international NGOs in this case to try to influence what happened in the countries, not just execute service delivery projects and programs, but also influence the norms and laws and policies of the country, that increasingly was considered by many governments, at least, inappropriate, right? And therefore,
chime in on that too?
Yeah, would you
chime in on that as well? So I also would say, like Beth was saying, what's happening at the international level is changing as well. If you go back to advocacy that was happening 20 years ago and even 10 years ago, you'll find transcripts where you have somebody at the UN or at US Congress asking an NGO that's based in Washington, DC, what do the Brazilians think about that? What do the South Africans think about that? And that's no longer the order of the day. Now, if policymakers want to know what the Brazilians think, they want to ask the Brazilians. If they want to know what the South Africans think, they want to ask the South Africans. I think that's a positive evolution, but I think that's an evolution that changes the role that many international NGOs had as sort of the spokespeople for marginalized communities or spokespeople for the global South. And so that's part of what's shifting as well.
Yes, very important, right? And in that sense, that shift started occurring, would you agree, both of you, or not, long before the current discourse on #shift to power, decolonizing aid, anti-racism, etc., right? That has been going on for a bit longer. Would you agree, or do you think I have that wrong?
Oh, sure. I think it's been going on for at least 10, if not 20 years. It's not something that happens overnight. It's a gradual shift.
It is.
I think about Janis Tallberg's work on the opening of international institutions. And of course, his work was published a decade ago. And of course, at that point, it's still looking back 5 years. So you figure like 15 years ago already, there was indicators that international institutions were looking to have activists from the global South have direct access to policymakers.
Yeah, and that makes me now think to my years back at the World Bank, when that was even in the mid-90s when that started to become gradually, and with lots of caveats and lots of limitations and lots of reasons to critique that, but still there were the first direct consultations, whatever the quality was of those consultations, but between Global South founded NGOs and the World Bank, not just Global North founded NGOs. So you make me look back on that. So you say, amongst others in the book, that quote, there's a trend of opening access for Global South founded civil society to international organizations that has accompanied the trend of closing civil society space at home. Maybe Beth, can you, the authors, say your book has a number of other authors who contributed to chapters. Where do they feel that access opened for them, and for whom in particular?
And I think it probably varies in terms of for whom across some of the different chapters. I mean, we had a couple of chapters that focused specifically on sort of Southern Cone and looked within Latin America, and again, sort of a dense set of international organizations there, both founded by some of these organizations that were working closer in sort of South-South networks. And so they actually kind of helped to generate growth of international organizations, as well as went out to seek increased access in organizations. And then, so again, that was sort of Susan Affey's work. And then thinking about Lisa Sundstrom and Laura Henry looking at the BRICS, and in particular, sort of growing activism by Chinese and Russian and Brazilian organizations. Again, varying a bit by issue area. So sort of seeing more environmental activism in particular. Obviously, again, many of these organizations were not given access to human rights things, for instance, but again, there was sort of a strong promotion of Chinese organizations' involvement in international organizations as well as at home around environmental issues, because that was sort of seen as a priority for both the organizations and the government. I think BRICS probably were sort of among the leaders, but again, some unevenness across the different BRICS that they found and across different organizations by issue too.
Yeah, I'm tempted to ask you a question about shifting rather than shrinking space, but I'm going to stop myself from doing that because I want to still make sure that we get to the core of your book arguments. So, Chris, turning to you, what do you feel are the implications of the argument the two of you are making in this book for what you think in the future, let's say the next 10 to 15 years out? What are still legitimate, credible, and needed roles for global North founded civil society? If, and indeed, as is the case, I would agree with you, and is a very good thing, if Global South NGOs do not need and have for quite a while often not needed Global North NGOs to jump in, if you will, in that boomerang model that you sketched out.
Sure. Well, one of the things that I'll point out by saying is that when I was doing research in Vietnam, not just on foreign aid reduction, but also on the advocacy piece, one of the things that was striking was that Vietnamese NGOs were doing a lot of advocacy on international issues and seeking to have like project criteria and parameters for Vietnam changed. And they're doing that on their own, largely without Northern partners. But in speaking with those NGOs, they also pointed out that they were resourced by Northern partners in different ways. So sometimes that was through training, sometimes that was through access by being invited to international forums where they could make connections and where they could, where they could share their views, and of course sometimes that was through money. I say that just by way of preface, that I think that there is a place for partnership, and there will probably always be a place for partnership. It's just that partnership looks different than it did in the past. So I think that previously, partnership between Northern and Southern NGOs looked like, by default, Northern NGOs leading. And then Northern NGOs, when they would lead, for a variety of different reasons, would oftentimes reframe issues in the ways that were most palatable or attractive to Northern audiences. And I think that mode of partnership is one that is getting a lot of pushback and is increasingly fading away. And there's a case study from Brazil, in fact, in the book that details some examples of this, where Brazilian NGOs begin their own campaign and Northern NGOs get involved, but the Northern NGOs, rather than stepping up and becoming the international face of the campaign or the leader of the campaign, remain in a supporting role to the Brazilian NGOs that continue to take the lead and hold the lead. And so I think that partnership is still essential. It's just that partnership looks like much more of a peer engagement. It can look like a sharing of expertise and training between NGOs. And that's happening South-South as well. And I think it continues to happen North-South. It can look like assistance with access and networking. And of course, it can always look like financial assistance. So I think that those things, that kind of partnership that focuses on resourcing, I think is probably a lot of what I expect to still happen. The other thing that I would say is that Northern NGOs play a crucial role in representing Northern stakeholders. So when we're looking at global issues and global solutions, Northern populations are also stakeholders in those issues and in crafting those solutions.
And I would argue, actually, Chris, they're not just stakeholders, they're also contributors to a number of the global issues, right? If you only think about climate change as one example, right? So yeah, that would argue, to my mind, for the fact that Global North NGOs really legitimately should focus more and more on their own populations, not just their governments, but their own populations in terms of not just policy and laws, but on behaviors, right? On norms and daily practices. I'm just jumping in here spontaneously. What do you think about that?
I think that's exactly right. I think that's exactly right. I think that's an excellent framing of it.
Okay. Yeah, I've been thinking about that quite a lot lately. Beth, anything you want to add to that around what do you feel are still legitimate roles for Global North NGOs? And I'm asking that, of course, partially because, as you know, both of you know, there's a lot of sustained critique coming from organized Global South civil society networks, etc., that says, listen, you Global North NGOs, you're still crowding us out. We don't need you anymore, and you need to get out of the way, and so on. So what is still legitimate for a Global North founded NGO to do in the future, Beth?
I think especially as some of the issues either are coming from or sort of the core blockage is actually in the North. So I'm thinking in terms of things like crowdsourcing and crowdfunding for deeply conservative, sort of populist, potentially anti-democratic, anti-women's rights, anti sort of choice, anti-freedom of speech, as that sort of flows out of US and Canada, then I think that's creating issues abroad. It makes it much harder to argue that, sort of you have these beacons of representation that we need to be modeling ourselves upon, because they themselves, right? So if you want to think about closing civil society space, right, the United States and Canada seem to be not going very slow that direction. There seems to be some big leaps there.
Absolutely. UK, Australia, the same thing. Closing civil society or civil space is definitely not only happening in the Global South at all.
And so I think both as models and also as sources of the issue, and again, the money that is in those places towards some of these sort of, again, they're sort of feeling very active advocacy campaigns going. They're anti-liberal, but they're still very active and kind of advocacy campaigns. And so having to sort of ramp up, I guess, some of the liberal campaigns against
to counter that narrative. Yes. That too, we could go deeper into, but we don't have time. So let me, Chris, turning to you. So in a nutshell, you use a term in the book and also in the title that is transscalar activism. Now, I had a hard time imagining what that would be. So I'd like you to explain in everyday kind of lay language, what does that mean, transscalar activism?
Sure. So at one level, at a simplest level, scales are different levels of action. And perhaps it's a place where we've chosen a piece of academic speak, because the academic literature already used this language of scales of action. But I think it's chosen in part because depending upon the level in which you act, your campaign is necessarily either bigger or smaller. So if you act at the municipal level, you're engaging with maybe just say a dozen council members. Or maybe a few tens of thousands of citizens that you're engaging. And if you act at sort of the state or provincial level, that multiplies by 2 or 3 or 5 times. You act at the national level, now you're engaging with several hundred policymakers and perhaps millions of citizens. And then you act at the global level or the regional level or the global level, and the scale increases again. So scales refer to levels of action, but we take the word scale to also help reflect the fact that when you operate at different levels, it necessarily changes the size and scope of what it is that you're doing.
And I believe, am I right in thinking that you argue in the book that Global South founded advocacy organizations decide on their own, and often in fact, you say through action, that is, they do, I don't know how to say this in English, not unilaterally, but they decide on their own the levels of actions that they think are most appropriate, matching the needs of the campaign, right? And they may also shift levels when they feel that is prudent. Am I saying this right or not?
Yes, that's absolutely right.
Yeah.
So I think the idea is that in the sort of boomerang era, so again, going back 20, 25 years, anything that was a local problem was almost necessarily, or a national problem, was necessarily escalated up to a global level and became a global campaign, because there wasn't the opportunity or the capacity to solve it at the local scale. But these days, that's no longer the case. You have you have better democratic systems in many developing countries. And as a result, it's possible to solve a municipal problem at the municipal level or a national problem using the national judiciary. It doesn't necessarily have to get escalated up to the international level. Yet, nonetheless, those local decisions change how global policy is implemented at the local level. So it's still part of the crafting of global policy and shaping the implementation of global policy. And so local NGOs choose to operate at the scale that is most strategic for them. So it might have to do with their resources, it might have to do with their prior experience, it might have to do with who their partners are and where their partners operate. And of course, it has to do with the national context, whether or not they actually can gain access to the national government or whether they trust the national judiciary. But all of those different calculations in terms of their organizational capacity and their assessment of their context get calculated into a strategic decision about the scale of operation.
Yeah, and that decision is theirs, right? You're saying increasingly so. So looking at the time, I want to just end on maybe touching upon one or two of the predictions or hypotheses that you end the book with. And so you say, and I'll just pick one here. The first one is you say Southern-based and Southern-directed advocacy will increase. That's one of your hypotheses or predictions that you end the book on, will increase as more states arrive at middle-income status. Middle-income states are more likely to have high-capacity advocacy organizations staffed by well-educated professionals, as Beth already also said earlier, who choose advocacy work out of a sense of passion or calling, rather than in response to a scarcity of formal sector jobs. Beth, tell us a little bit more about that hypothesis. What do you say in the book about that?
Because in some part it has to do with, as you mentioned before, this sort of decreased competition from international actors, which allows a bit of space for organizations to grow and sort of make it past those early kind of hard days of founding in order to become more established, sort of stronger organizations. There's also, I guess, a sense of, of increasing empathy, sympathy, kind of common interest between some of these organizations and their home governments. So rather than it being that the two are always at loggerheads, they actually have common shared interests and agendas. It behooves both the organizations and the government to sort of work together against potentially outside actors. I'm thinking about sort of some of the cases about sort of access to medicines, access to drugs, right? COVID-19 probably also sort of sharpened some of that.
Interesting. Yeah, you're right.
So they would want to support each other. They would want to sort of build each other again. And if success brings success, that they again, having shared interests can sort of mention how they're having advocacy success at home, but then also then go as a common united front against either other governments or against international organizations. So it's the increased space. And then the sense that in some cases, again, not across all issues, right? Presumably these are not organizations that are going to be engaged in human rights practices, but when it comes to where there are the shared interests, whether it's sort of drugs, technology, environmental sorts of protections, that there's sort of a reason for the two to want to mutually support each other. And I guess also this growing sense that because of changes in technology, changes in sort of global governance, changes in, or an acknowledgement of how complex issues are and how they sync to so many different levels, that some very large issues really do have huge implications, good or bad, at really local levels. I'm thinking about, there are two cases in the book. One had to do with efforts to try to stop early marriage and sexual violence against women, especially FGM. And the idea was that
would you mind to explain what FGM is for those who don't know?
Female genital mutilation. And again, the idea that there are strong international laws, strong international norms, and even very strong national laws. And in this case, it comes from Kenya. But the local practices go underground. And the way to really stop that was by having to bring in sort of traditional authorities, particularly Maasai chiefs. And so the sense in which the issue was, which was sort of big, huge, global, has such immediate, important local implications that, again, I think that sort of stimulates the growth of strong organizations working in sort of common interests with local authorities as well as national authorities, each of them strengthening each other to sort of tackle the issue. The other example was the case of right, so Monsanto, global sort of, biotech corporation, which was seen as unstoppable in many places, actually gets stopped by organizations of Mayan beekeepers. And so again, this is not a group that I think intended to develop strong institutional strengths, but had to take Monsanto to court and therefore had to build the expertise and the capacity in order to use sort of national institutions against this sort of seemingly unstoppable international organization. Again, capacity kind of gets built because there's some common interest between government institutions and nonprofit organizations that then professionalize to meet the challenges that now are much more complex and intertwined than previously seen.
That's actually, in my mind, a very hope-giving example that you just gave. So it's good that that we raised that towards the end. Maybe Chris, one more hypothesis from the book. You say we also expect to see less marketing and reframing of local causes on the part of activists who seek to attract international partners to their causes due to advances in global communications. Tell me more about that.
Sure, certainly. So again, as I'm sure many of your listeners will appreciate, when doing international advocacy in the sort of pre-YouTube, pre-social media era, you were dealing with oftentimes physically limited print space and chronologically limited airtime. So if you wanted an issue covered, it had to be deemed worthy of the editor of the New York Times or the Economist or the FT or of the producer of ABC Nightly News. It had to be deemed worthy to fit within their scarce space. And so in order to attract a global audience, you had to frame your issue in a way that would be attractive to that set of gatekeepers so that they would give you some of their limited space in their print publication or some of their limited time in their news broadcast. And a couple of things have changed. One is the 24-hour news cycle. There's simply much more space than there used to be because there, with online news media and kind of continual broadcasts, there's producers have to fill a lot of space, editors have to fill a lot of space. It's not so much scarce anymore. Now they're actually trying to bring more in. That's one piece of it. But the other piece is that social media and changes in communication technology have democratized access to a global audience. So you can record something on your cell phone in the Niger Delta, and it can go viral just as easily as it could if you, recorded it with, a $5,000 camera from New York City. It doesn't matter. If people see it and they like it and they share it and they recommend it, then it'll appear at the top of the algorithm. And the algorithm will put it to the top of the page, and suddenly you'll have 1 million views. And the fact that can happen on just about any social media platform, whether it's Instagram or Twitter or YouTube, means that it's possible for local activists to get their views out in front of a global audience without having to do the sort of reframing that happened in previous eras.
And without the reframing for, let's say, global North audiences, and without any support really needed of global North NGOs, which is, I would argue, why it's so important that global North founded NGOs are really rethinking their roles. We have run out of time. I had at least another couple of questions, but that won't be possible, at least not during this interview. So let me close, Beth, first turning to you. Now that we've learned about your interesting book, the argument you make in the book, and your broader research agenda, where should people go if they want to learn more about your work and also connect with you?
I guess Google Scholar and ResearchGate probably are the best sources.
Okay, so then we will put those links to your work in the show notes so that people can find it. How about you, Chris?
So my university keeps a lot of my work online at works.bpress.com/Christopher-Pallas.
Okay.
And I think that will go in the show notes as well.
Yeah.
And you can also contact me through that page.
Okay, through that page we can do. So we'll put those links in the show notes, listeners, and so you don't have to be scribbling them down just like I just try to do frantically, and so that you can access them in the show notes. Well, thank you, Beth and Chris, for all your insights on this important topic. It's a more of a conceptual topic, but it's a very important one. And thank you, listeners. If you found this podcast stimulating, then I'd love to also point you to some other episodes in my podcast about campaigning strategies. There is, for instance, episode 18 with Paula O'Brien, formerly at Oxfam America and now the executive director of Amnesty US. And you can find all these episodes not just on my website, 5oaksconsulting.org with the number 5, but also on my YouTube channel. Subscribe to my email list, and you will always be the first to be in the know. And with that, and I am struggling with my page here, I want to say thank you, listeners. This is Tosca, and I look forward to spending time with you on NGO Soul and Strategy next time.